flesh side, they wanted freedom from their slavery to the Romans. And they were really hopeful that Christ had come for that. In Luke 19:41, it says, when he approached Jerusalem, he saw the city and wept over it, saying, if you had known this day, in this day, even you, the things which make for peace, but now they have been hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will throw up a barricade against you and surround you and hem you in on every side. And they will level you to the ground and your children within you, and they will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not recognize the time of your salvation. This wasn't a joyous day for Jesus. This was a day when he saw, because he was seeing in the Spirit, what was coming. He could see that he hadn't gotten through to all the people he wanted to get through to, and he could also see that their city and everything was going to be destroyed in a few years. In about 40 years, everything was going to be leveled. All of Jerusalem was going to be leveled. Many of those people that were there that day were probably caught up in that destruction of Jerusalem. And Jesus was sad about it. He was sad about it. Same as when we discussed last week when we talked about Lazarus rising. Jesus wept. He saw all these people that were so sad that Lazarus had died and he even asked Martha, he asked Martha, do you believe that you will never die? Yes, I believe, but if you were here, you wouldn't have died. You just don't get it. You don't quite get it. And he knew that later on they would, when the Holy Spirit came, but that was just his friends there. How about all the others? All those that he had healed, all those that he had preached to, all of those thousands of people that he had touched during his time on the earth. So here he is now, grieved. He's grieved. It's his last week and he knows it. He's not grieved because he's going to die, because he knows he's not going to die. Oddly enough, even in the sadness and the hope that he was giving, sadness and hope, he told the disciples at the Last Supper, he told the disciples that he was going to die, that he was going away, and that the Holy Spirit would come. But at the same time, he's telling them everything they need to know, except that he's going to rise from the dead. He didn't tell them that. That one even took Satan by surprise. Satan didn't even expect that to come. So we see that this time is a really sad time for the disciples as toward the end of the week, but at the beginning of the week, everybody's real happy. So let's go through some of the things that happened on Sunday. After all this parade coming into Jerusalem. In Mark 11, we read this. Then they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were buying and selling in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. And he would not permit anyone to carry merchandise through the temple. And he began to teach and say to them, is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations? But you have made it a den of robbers. You have made it a robber's den. Why was he so mad? Well, this was the second time that he'd done this. First of all, he had done this, John tells us that he did it in the very beginning of his ministry. Now this is the second time. One of the things that I'm sure that was making him so upset was that area was the only area where non-Jewish people could come to seek God. So as the non-Jewish people came up to seek God, they were met with this den of robbers. People that were exchanging money. You had to, in order to give the temple tax, in order to give your sacrifices, you had to buy your animals there. That's for the Jews. The non-Jewish people didn't do that. But for the Jews, they had to buy their animals, which meant if they had Roman currency, or Tyrus currency, they would have to exchange that currency into Jewish currency, so that because the Roman currency was considered evil, had a picture of Caesar on it. Caesar considered himself God. So that was despicable to them. So they had to exchange their money. So they were charging exuberant rates for exchanging the money. And it was like a madhouse out there. And it was the only place that non-believers, non-Jews, could go to seek God. And all they see is this mess. Jesus physically throws them out, gets rid of them. And here we are 2,000 years later, and we haven't learned a thing. Here we are 2,000 years later, and we walk into a church, and before we even get into the sanctuary, we have an ATM that meets us so that we can make sure that we give our money. Some places you walk in, and there are bookstores and coffee shops and all this stuff and all these things going on before you get in there. What's an unbeliever to think? It's the same scenario. It's exactly the same scenario. Exactly. After that, he stayed in the temple, and the Pharisees challenged him. The Pharisees always challenged him. They were still pushing back. Now remember, the Pharisees, we look at them as the enemy, but they're not the enemy. They are the leaders of the Jewish nation. They're supposed to be the friends, but they're not. They're constantly challenging them. And we get to Monday. In Mark 11, it tells us about him cursing a fig tree. Jesus walked past a fig tree, and he wants to eat a fig, and there are no figs on it. And he curses the fig tree and said, it will never produce fruit again. It will never produce fruit again. The fig tree was the symbol of Israel, and it was dead. It was producing no fruit. And the Pharisees were absolute proof of that, because they're the ones that are pushing back on Jesus constantly. The rest of the day, he taught parables. He taught the parable of the two sons. He taught the parable of the landowner, and I'm going to go through these. We're not going to go through every parable or anything. I want you to read these during this coming week. Spend Holy Week the way it should be spent in your scriptures. On Tuesday, they spent hours, the Pharisees spent hours trying to trap him. They asked him about paying taxes to Caesar. They asked him about marriage and the resurrection. They asked him about the source of his authority. Where do you get your authority from? As if he hadn't answered all those questions 100 times before. They kept asking him the same thing over and over and over again. Where do you get your authority? They didn't get it because they didn't want to get it. Scriptures tell us that he spoke with authority. When he originally went into the temple and opened the scriptures and read out of Isaiah a description of himself. And the scriptures say that he spoke with authority, which meant that for it to say that, it meant that his authority stuck out above the other teachers. He spoke with authority. And here we are over 3 years later, and they still don't get it. Does it sound familiar? Really? Just to put it nicely, for some, how long are you going to go before you get it? How long are you going to walk in the shoes of the Pharisees? How long are you going to resist what you know to be true, but you don't want to submit to because you're afraid it's going to alter your life? Tuesday, he continued. He went on with marriage, the marriage feast, the parable of the marriage feast. This one is significant. It's about a king who invites his people to a marriage, to a wedding feast. And in this wedding feast, although he invited all his people to the wedding feast, they didn't come. They made up every lame excuse they could possibly figure out to make up. I have to go here, I have to go do this, I'm going to be busy today. Does that sound familiar? I'm just too busy, I can't go, I have to go and do this, I got to attend to this, I got to attend to that. Out of all the people, so what does he do? He turns around and says, all right, go out and invite everybody in the streets. What is he talking about? The Jews were invited to the revelation of the Son of God in their midst. They were invited to that. They were invited to be a part of that. And they didn't show up. They used every excuse not to show up. And then what does the king do? He says, go out and get all the people and bring them in. The people in the streets, just bring them in. That's the Gentiles. They are the Gentiles. Go out and get the Gentiles. Since my people won't get it, bring everybody in. Which is exactly what was about to happen. And so the Gentiles got to come in. And then there was one. There was one that the king noticed that wasn't wearing wedding clothes, because wedding clothes were provided for everybody. If you came in and you didn't have any money, or you weren't in the streets, you didn't know how to dress or whatever, they would give you wedding clothes so that you would have wedding clothes to be in the presence of what was going on and in the presence of the king. But one person was sitting there without the wedding clothes. He knew enough to come to the wedding, but he did not put on the wedding clothes. King told him to throw him out into the street, into the outer darkness, where there would be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Okay, and I won't get into the theology behind that, but what I'm saying is, just lightly put, he knew about God, but he wouldn't submit to God. He came to the feast, but he wouldn't put on the clothes. They were offered to him, but he wouldn't put them on. Now that, just about everybody should fit into, because we resist putting on the wedding clothes. Jesus is telling them, he's telling them, you didn't get it, Gentiles are going to get it. He was ushering in a period that's generally known as the time of the Gentiles. He was prophesying that time was coming to pass. In Luke 21:24, it says, they fall by the edge of the sword. It says, Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So they were coming into the time of the Gentiles. Now the Bible does tell us that many of them had a veil over them. They couldn't see it. They couldn't see what was going on. But if you remember, with the situation with Pharaoh, Pharaoh had a hard heart, and God closed him off. If your heart is hard and you don't want to hear anything about it, you may be closed off, so that you won't ever go to God for anything. I happen to believe, because I've seen it play out in so many people's lives, that you get grace after grace after grace after grace after grace, and then the grace stops. And then you don't ever want to look at God again. You get mad at him, you walk away, you don't want to ever hear about it again, because you have refused every moment of grace that God's given you in your life. And eventually you go back and the grace is gone. You've hardened your heart. which means that you probably won't even try to go back. Because the grace, you've exhausted it. Here, God's own people, they didn't see his son. They had fallen so far. It had been 430 years at least since they had a prophet before Jesus came. So during those 400 years, they fell further and further away from God until they didn't even see him anymore. They were going through all the motions. They were going to church, they were going to temple, they were doing whatever they needed to do in order to do the things they needed to do. And they were doing, but they didn't know God. And when the Son of God came and walked right through the middle of them, they didn't know, they didn't recognize him. They had no idea he was coming. Later on that day, Jesus speaks the 8 woes, which is you can see how much he was grieving over Jerusalem. He spoke the 8 woes. And then he spoke his end times discourse. He went through the days of the end for them and for us, so that it would be documented, so that we would know what's going on throughout history. As history was made, we would know, but he was telling them history before it was coming. He told them that things were going to go on and on, and oddly enough, he didn't talk about a rapture, and he didn't talk about seeing the beginning of the tribulation. He goes right on up to the middle of the tribulation. He explains that things are going to get worse and worse and worse and worse. And there are going to be wars and earthquakes and all this stuff going on, and then there's going to be abomination of desolation. That's halfway through the tribulation. So he explains all this to them, and they didn't really get it all. Think about this. If you didn't even know about any of this stuff, and somebody was telling you this, even if it was Jesus telling you this, your head would be swimming. It's like, oh, whoa. Is it too much, what do they say, too TMI? Too much information. That's just, well, slow down. He's in his last week. He's going to make sure that they have it all down so that they can go back and reference. He's going to make sure that they've heard what they need to hear. He's taking care, he's tying up all of the loose ends before he goes to the cross. Because he knows the cross is coming. He's the only one that knows the cross is coming. And so now he's teaching and teaching and teaching, pouring himself out. What could he have done? He could have turned around and left. He could have just gone and gotten lost in the desert somewhere. No, this isn't happening. I'm not going to no cross. But he didn't do that. He didn't do that. He willingly went to the cross. On Wednesday, following day, kind of a calm day, he has dinner with Lazarus and Martha and Mary. He goes back to Bethany and has dinner. Mary breaks open an alabaster jar. Disciples get upset. The one that gets upset the most is Judas. He was the thief. They get upset because that jar was worth a year's wages. The oil that was in that jar. Nard, they called it. It's perfume. And she poured that on him, and she anointed him with that, not realizing that this was actually a part of him going to the grave. She pours it over his head and feet. Judas Iscariot gets upset. He doesn't want to see that happen because it costs money. All the disciples were a little bit aggravated about it, but especially Judas. That same day, Judas went out to make his deal. He went out to make the deal with the Pharisees, with the chief priests, for 30 pieces of silver. You know what that was? That was the price of a slave. That was the price of a slave. He sold out one of his closest friends for the price of a slave. And Jesus knew it all along. Jesus knew who it was. He just let him do it. Why? Because it was meant to be done. It was God's will. Jesus only did what he knew the Father wanted done. He only acted in ways that he knew the Father wanted him to act. Judas was going to betray him. He could have stopped that at any time. Had he stopped that, they wouldn't have known where to go get him in the garden. He was the one that led him there. Didn't end very well for Judas. But when we start to look at the reality of what went on during that week, and we get immersed in that, we start seeing that Jesus willingly, every day of this week, got up and got closer to the day that he knew he was going to be tortured and put to death, and didn't even have a thought about turning and running, about going and hiding, disappearing. He had avoided capture many times during his ministry. They had come after him, they wanted to stone him, they wanted to do all these things, and he just slid out, they didn't even leave. This time, he walked straight into the mouth of the lion. Why? Because that's what God wanted. And because God wanted it, that's what he wanted. You see, Jesus is demonstrating